So you were born in St. Paul, Minnesota.
I was.
And how big was your family?
I was one of 8 children. I was the 6th out of 8. So I have 4 brothers, or had 4 brothers and 4 sisters. I'm sorry to say there are only 3 of us who have survived.
Okay. And what were your parents' names?
My father was Frederick D. McCarthy, and he was born on the west side of St. Paul, a poor Irish family. He worked his way up through the St. Paul Street Railway, educated himself in the law, and eventually became the senior lawyer for the Northern Pacific Railway, and eventually represented all the railroads west of Chicago.
And your mother?
My mother was Florence Ruth Milton. Her family, her father was also an immigrant. He came indirectly to St. Paul, started the dairy business, invented a method for transforming cream into cheese, and made millions of dollars, became the biggest dairy person in Minnesota and Wisconsin. They were the richest family in Minnesota and lost their fortune entirely in the crash of 1929. So she went from great wealth to total poverty.
And tell me a little bit about your education.
Well, my mother was a convert to Catholicism. My father was a devout Catholic. I went to St. Mark's Grade School, St. Thomas Military Academy, which was a military academy that taught us military tactics, so that my fellow classmates in 1944, when I graduated, went immediately into the service as officers. We graduated in June of 1944, and by August of that year, when the truce in Europe was signed, 7 of my classmates were already dead. So that was a very sobering and maturing event. I then went to the College of St. Thomas, and I tried several different lines, but I ended up with a degree in mathematics, but I took my minor subjects in law, and so then I went the next year to the University of Minnesota Law School. And from there, I decided I didn't want to pursue a career at law, so I went in the seminary with the Paulist Fathers. I spent a year in the novitiate in Silence in New Jersey, and then came to Washington, D.C. seminary, where I spent 6 years, actually 7, because I developed tuberculosis and spent 2 years in a sanatorium out in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Then returned to the seminary, made up 1 year, but was ordained a Catholic priest in 1956. After ordination, I spent a short time doing pastoral work in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and then I was sent on for graduate work in philosophy and political science at the University of Toronto in Canada, where I got a master's degree and a PhD, the PhD in 1960.
Mm-hmm. And what was the theme of your PhD?
The theme of my PhD was the story of the political views of a well-known New Englander, well-known at the time, Orestes Brownson, who for 35 years published his own journal. He was self-educated. He had never been to school, but he read and spoke 7 languages, and he reviewed most of the current literature of the day. And his greatest work was probably his work on the American Republic. And Woodrow Wilson said it was the greatest commentary on U.S. government ever written. A lot of people disagreed with that. But in any case, the only other person to write a thesis on Brownson was Arthur Schlesinger. So the two of us chose the same person. But I covered Brownson's later life. He covered his earlier life. He was much more liberal in his early days. He was a Unitarian who eventually became a Catholic. He advised Lincoln on the Emancipation Proclamation, but he said the poor people in the North, particularly in New York and Boston in the sweatshops, were worse off than the slaves in the South. And he was unable to persuade Lincoln to open another mission of mercy. So he felt that he had partly failed, but nevertheless, he was a very interesting character.
So, the episode of tuberculosis that you went through, you said you spent 2 years recovering in the sanatorium.
Yes, it was about 20 months in total bed rest and about 4 months of learning to walk again.
How do you look back on those years? Are those lost years from your early adulthood? When you think back on those, what are your recollections of your thoughts at the time and how you were feeling?
My recollections are very positive. One, I learned to appreciate doctors and nurses and hospital regimen. I learned to appreciate small kindnesses, and the nurses there were very dedicated. They brought me plants, they brought me candies. After a while, most of my family and friends stopped visiting me because it was old hat. But the staff there were simply marvelous and very considerate. And I learned all about the lives of the 5 men who were in a ward with me together. And then at times, I think 22 times actually, I was placed on a litter and allowed to go to the room of people who were dying. And so I felt like I had a very special ministry to the dying at that time. I held hands of 22 men as their lives ebbed away. And for some of them I was able to pray, some of them I was able to laugh, and altogether it was a very enriching experience for me to see how people ended their lives.
It must have been a very difficult life lesson for a young man in his 20s with, a year of law school and some undergraduate work and a year of seminary under his belt, but, maybe not a lot of pastoral experience, for instance, where it was trial by fire, perhaps,
Yes.
of dealing with those sorts of issues.
The hardest part was reading, because we had total bed rest, and I did not even have a pillow, which meant that I had to lie on my back. I was not allowed to turn over because it might spread the tuberculosis. So I had to read holding a book over my head, and I could only read as long as I could hold the book upright. And so it usually was limited to about 20-minute periods. But I learned a lot about how to get along with others. We played a lot of chess, even though we would have to call out the moves to somebody in another bed. So I loved chess, checkers, and we learned to play games. We found lots of ways to entertain one another. And so I look back on it as a very maturing and elevating process rather than something that I wish had not happened. I think it was a major part of my clerical education.
And so after that time, as you said, you actually were ordained and served as a priest. And, what were those years like for you? And what impact did they have on your life after the priesthood?
They were simply wonderful. I was ordained, and I went to Toronto for my graduate education, but I lived in St. Peter's Parish up there, so I was able to exercise ministry on weekends, and occasionally during the summer I served as a hospital chaplain, which also got me very interested in medical issues and was very enlightening to me. And so I learned a lot about medicine from the doctors, the nurses. I was allowed to read the charts of all the Catholic patients that I was ministering to, and that was very illuminating and very touching. And their response was simply overwhelming. The courage of patients is not well understood, I think, but many facing death or serious illness exhibited enormous courage.
And so during this time, as you said, you were obtaining your PhD and studying philosophy and ethics and politics, and you end up at the Catholic University in Washington,
yes,
teaching political science.
I spent a year writing my thesis in Boston, and had privileges to study at the Athenaeum, which is a very exclusive library, and there I was helped greatly by the librarians. I gathered material and finished it in Washington, D.C., where I taught in the seminary for a little over 10 years, and about 6 years at Catholic University. Toward the end of that 6 years, my department had moved over to George Washington University, so I taught an adjunct course over there that included, in those days, wives of congressmen rarely were elected to office, and they rarely knew much about the Congress. So my course was to teach political science to congressional wives who were trying to figure out what in the world was happening to their husbands who were elected to the Congress. I think at that time there was only one woman in Congress, but I'm not certain about that.
And as you were essentially a professor of political science, was there a point or at a time when, a switch went off and you realized you might be interested in something outside of academia?
Well, yes, that's true. Partly it was the decade of the 60s, and all kinds of activities were going on in Washington. Scarcely a week went by there wasn't a demonstration about something, often led by students, but frequently unions or other political groups. Also, hearings were held regularly on anti-Americanism and various topics. And of course, it was easy for me, it was actually walking distance to the Capitol to go down and sit in on those hearings. So I heard some of the Joe McCarthy hearings that were broadcast by air, and eventually some of them made it onto television. Television was just coming into the living rooms of the American people. It had been discovered long before, but it became common in the late 50s and 60s. So all of a sudden we saw politics in a whole new light, literally on the screen. And as it turned out, I began to listen to a lot of congressional hearings on the tube, and that whetted my appetite for politics.
But you were also not just seeing them on the tube, but in real time. So, what impact of, say, going to the McCarthy hearings, how did that influence your thinking?
Well, it made me aware that most ministers of the gospel were much too narrow. They were not addressing problems that at least thousands of Americans were facing. The Paulist Fathers were dedicated. They called themselves apostles to Main Street. And I felt that a major part of what it means to be an apostle on Main Street is to be involved in tax work, in medical legislation, in all kinds of legislation that was being discussed at the time. And of course, I was deeply involved in debates about the pros and cons of the Vietnam War, which began to take over the consciousness of virtually all the students who talked about little else during those days. And we saw a migration of students who, at least at Catholic U, many of them came because it had a great department of education, philosophy, and theology. And because of the Vietnam War, a lot of those bright and capable students moved over to the political science department. And we went from about 35 students in the university to about 435 students. And we had a very small faculty. They couldn't hire faculty fast enough to deal with the students. So it was a very challenging time. And I found myself teaching not only in the classroom, but making friends with the students and teaching them half the night in the local pub, where great discussions went on about all aspects of politics.
So Charlie, in this time, it's a time of a lot of transformation at the national level. You're talking about the protests going on and the activist movements. It was also a time of transition for you, and you found yourself moving from Catholic University to work for the government and leaving the priesthood at the same time.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about that time of transition in your life?
Well, it happened about that time that Humanae Vitae, the encyclical on contraception, was issued by the Catholic Church. I read it very carefully. I studied all the references and came to the conclusion that it was a serious mistake to write it that way. And so I joined with 42 other priests, to protest the publication of the encyclical to Cardinal McIntyre. Now, at that time, the Canadian bishops had decided it was not worth publishing. The Dutch bishops had decided it was not worth publishing, and we were asking the American bishops to follow suit and not publish it. Instead, what happened was Cardinal McIntyre disenfranchised 40 priests in his diocese. They were, in effect, kicked out of the priesthood. And that made me very angry. I felt an injustice had been done to colleagues and friends. And so I began to think about whether I ought to protest by voluntarily leaving the priesthood. At the same time, or at least in the same period of time, the bishops sent me to Wisconsin to participate in a national program that was run by the National Council of Churches. And the Catholic bishops were trying to decide whether they should join this organization. What happened was I spent 10 days in that meeting, and we were broken into small groups. And in one of the groups was a very attractive, brilliant lady who was a Presbyterian. In fact, she was the head of the education program of the entire Presbyterian Church. And by the end of 10 days of meeting, we were, I think it's fair to say, we were in love. And so the combination of my disaffection with the behavior of the clergy, particularly of the cardinal, and my attraction to Estelle started me thinking about the possibility of another career. Now that took 4 years to play itself out, but in 1971 I left the priesthood, married Estelle, and in the course of some of my dealings with lay people, I had met a brilliant gentleman named Tom Kennedy, and when he got wind that I was leaving the priesthood, I received a call one day inviting me to come to his office, and he offered me a job at the National Institutes of Health. It was very welcome because I had no money of my own. I was given an allowance every month. So when I left the priesthood, they gave me $300, and that I had no bank account, no anything except the $300. And it was a nervous time because Nixon had placed a freeze on federal hiring, and I didn't know if I was going to get the NIH job. Fortunately, Dr. Kennedy, Tom Kennedy, had processed my papers before the freeze took place. So by, I think, 24 or 48 hours, I missed the freeze, and I went to work for the National Institutes of Health.
And you were a legislative analyst?
Well, that's what I was assigned to do. I was a legislative analyst, and that meant tracking all the health bills that were presented in, at that time, the 92nd Congress, 91st Congress. And about 135 bills were introduced, and it was my job to go to the hearings, to analyze the bills, and report to my agency, the National Institutes of Health, the potential effect of each of those bills on their work, and to predict which bills would survive and be enacted, which bills would die, and which clauses out of bills that were dying might be saved and incorporated in another. So it was a busy time. It was 1970 and 71, and most of the hearings were carried out either under the aegis of Senator Ted Kennedy, or in the Senate, or Paul Rogers from Florida, who was known as Mr. Health in the Congress, in the House.
So you've got your first job with NIH, and did it meet expectations? From that point, did you feel like you had found a professional home within government service?
I certainly did. First of all, my immediate boss was Ray Wommeldorf, who was also a former minister, so we had lots in common. Secondly, my senior boss was Tom Kennedy, and Tom was a tough, hard-bitten Irishman, and when he would yell at me, I found myself laughing, and that infuriated him, and he would say, "What are you laughing at?" And I would say, "If I close my eyes, I can hear my Irish father disciplining me, and it's music to my ears." And he never quite knew whether I was, what to do with me, because I was not cowed by his anger and he sometimes did get angry, but he was a brilliant tactician. He was very wise in medical matters. He was politically very astute, and so we got to be great friends. And I admired him till the day I died. I thought he was a wonderful man.
And you were maybe you weren't an atypical new employee. You were basically making a mid-career change. You were in your 40s.
I was 45.
Yeah.
I had never worked in the government. I was trying to get hold of, fortunately, I worked in a big bureaucracy, the Catholic Church, and I understood something about the vagaries of bureaucracy. I had worked in the university, 2 universities, and I had been in the healthcare system. All of that learning came to play when I went to work for the U.S. government, where I found not only was the bureaucracy very upright, but I found there were less things to complain about in the government than I had found in the church or the university. or in lots of other societies to which I was a member, or in which I was a member. So I quickly, maybe not so quickly, it took me 9 or 10 months because there were 18 institutes, each with many subparts, and they all designated themselves by initials. So I had to learn about 100 acronyms for different parts of NIH before I could function. And so my learning curve was very steep. And in addition, of course, I had to learn my way around the Congress. Senator Ted Kennedy was elected for his first term the year I came to NIH, and he started, I think perhaps because he had a sister who was handicapped as a child, he started hearings right away on child health and human development and expanded those to such issues as frontal lobotomy, to issues of whether drugs were properly prepared and tested before they were put on the market. We found it was customary in those days for drug firms to give drugs to physicians and to pay the physicians to test them on their patients, but they never told their patients these were experimental drugs. So we found lots to criticize in the medical world, and Senator Kennedy began to pick up a lot of that criticism. It was aided and abetted, that is, the concern about all that, by the thalidomide disaster that occurred in Europe, and it was on American television to the point where most Americans think thalidomide babies were in this country. In fact, they were not. But and it was a great credit to the FDA that they had forbidden the use of thalidomide in this country until further testing occurred in animals. And so we saved a disaster. But I was greatly inspired by the lady at FDA whose name I'm blocking on
Frances.
right now.
Frances Kelsey?
Frances Kelsey, that's the name. And Frances Kelsey and I became great friends. She often visited my home, and we talked about how the government could be revised to do a better job, both of screening drugs and devices, so that the public would be better served. And she was an old hand in the government and taught me a lot. And she was also very tough. She withstood all kinds of pressure to approve thalidomide and eventually won a presidential award for her service. And she was an inspiration to me. I was assigned, because I was in the legislative office, to cover both Senator Kennedy's hearings and Paul Rogers' hearings. Senator Kennedy held hearings on contraceptives, particularly contraceptives that were given to Hispanic women who probably didn't understand the consent form. They were not informed, or at least did not understand that if the drugs didn't work, they would get pregnant. And many of them thought they were protected against pregnancy, only to find that they were pregnant. And so it led to something of a scandalous kind of misinformation or abuse of poor and migrant Hispanic people in this country, and it was very scandalous. There was also, as I think I mentioned, there was psychosurgery done in Boston on persons so that frontal lobotomy took place, and they were reduced almost to a vegetative state. There were other abuses of people who were mentally retarded, who were sterilized. I attended all those hearings and saw that while our general medical capability in this country was expanding and improving, there were lots of scandalous and inexplainable shortcomings in the way we delivered health care. And that was very interesting to me.
So you had, you were onboarding with the government at a time where a lot of things were being looked at critically, and you had a front row seat to the public becoming aware of what was happening in Tuskegee, in Alabama.
I did. But first let me say that even before that happened, I had made friends. That it's hard for somebody who sees how divided our Congress is today to realize how close the cooperation was then, both between the parties in the House and the Senate, but also among the staff with their principals, the senators and congressmen, and how easy it was for somebody who was concerned about health from the National Institutes of Health. I was in the executive branch, but I spent hours and hours of time with the staff of Senator Javits, Senator Kennedy, Republican, or Representative Rogers. I got to know their staffs. I actually wrote speeches for some of the congressmen when they wanted information about different diseases. So it was a very rich set of experiences I had in those days. Every day was exciting.
You were living the political science you taught for all those years.
I was, and I saw how it was actually played out in practice. And it's hard for me to believe now how divided the Congress is, because it was so united in serving the common good in those days. So yes, I did sit through lots of hearings that were particularly developed by Senator Kennedy. His interest particularly in retarded children and handicapped children never waned. And so no matter what the hearing was about, sooner or later that topic was addressed. Toward the end of it was getting toward 1974, late in 1973, the conversation changed from abuses to correction of the abuses. And hearings began to be held about commissions. Mm-hmm. And Senator Kennedy wanted to create another federal agency similar to the Exchange Commission to ride herd on medical research, because he had heard so many cases of abused persons in research, including those down in Texas where a sheep's heart was planted into a human being, and the human being expired in something like a minute and 30 seconds. There was some wonderful research being done, but there were some terrible things being done in the name of research. And Kennedy, and particularly Rogers, both wanted to stop those abuses without undermining the whole research effort. NIH's budget grew while I was there from a little over $1 billion a year to $10 billion. And NIH was scrambling to find projects in which to spend that money. And consequently, some of them were not so carefully reviewed, and some of them went sour. And the Congress and the Senate were very critical of research that turned out badly or that they considered unjust. And so when the Tuskegee study, which involved not treating approximately 400 black syphilitic patients over a whole lifetime. When that came to light, my boss brought the records of that whole Tuskegee report, put it on my desk, and as I recall it, he said, "The New York Times is going to publish a critique of this research on Friday. I want a report on my desk of how the government can defend itself for having having conducted such research." And in fact, it wasn't very hard to review because year after year the reports were almost identical. And these men were systematically denied treatment for their syphilis long after penicillin had been discovered and was available to them to cure them. And many of them went to their death untreated when we had very effective treatment for them available. And so it was inexcusable. So,
and yet you were asked to write the rebuttal or the government defense?
I was asked to defend the government's position. And I remember writing a very short letter, short memorandum, saying there can be no defense for the Tuskegee study. Initially, it may have been defensible when we had no good remedy, but after penicillin, there can be no justification for what was done. That memo went through the head of the legislative office, through the vice president for program planning, through the director, through the assistant secretary for health, and it ended up on the desk of Elliot Richardson, who was then secretary of what was then HEW.
Yeah.
And consequently, it's the only memo I ever sent that wasn't rewritten on the way up the line. Consequently, Secretary Elliott called me to his office and said, "What should we do?" We discussed it for a while. He asked me to write testimony, and that's when I recommended that we strengthen the Office for Protection from Research Risks, which didn't bear that name, by the way. It was part of the Grants Office, so it was part of Division of Research Grants, and its initials were IRB. It was the Institutional Relations Branch that solved problems between awardee NIH and or awarding NIH and awardee institutions. And so they already had an outgoing program to institutions all over the country, and they added to that program the care of research subjects.